and it's my time to talk some more about deviance. It used to be very much one of my favorite subjects. I used to say, so little time, so many perversions. That was a kind of slogan of my youth. But now, that was then and this is now. And now it is an academic subject. And so we're going to continue talking about it. So last time, what I ended with was speaking about this issue of relativism. And this looms so large in contemporary intellectual thought, relativism. Have I got that right? Yes. No. It's okay. Tell me which letter is wrong. Okay, is the R wrong? No. Is good. Okay, good. Thank you, class. And relativism. And now that we all know how to spell it, I hope everybody has at least an inkling of what it means. And it's the problem that, in fact, is caused by the social sciences, or at least increased attention to it in the social sciences, sociology and anthropology in particular, because people like me are always bringing to other people's attention the idea that there are not absolute things in the world, or it doesn't seem like there are, and particularly things like good and evil. The issue of ethnocentrism preaches, perhaps, that it is all relative, and that what doesn't make sense in one culture makes sense in another. And India's sacred cow was kind of our icon of that kind of phenomenon. But aren't there things like murder, for example, killing other people, maiming other people, torturing them, which are, in a way, absolutely wrong and should be held wrong for all cultures and all societies? What about child molestation? Isn't that true for all times and all places? And in contemporary times, what about child pornography? Where will you get off this boat or stay on this boat and think that it's not contingent and that there should be absolutes, things that we regard as right and wrong for all times and all peoples? And this then brings us right on to that problem that we began with when we talked about the Hawaiians and how natives think, is who are we to make judgments? Well, maybe we are the people to make judgments about how other people think. And maybe if we can make those kinds of judgments, we can also say that some of the things they do are wrong. Like, for example, mutilating is the term that's sometimes used, mutilating females at birth so that they experience sexuality in a different way, or perhaps not even sexuality at all, in the way that we, at least the way we, in our custom, women in our cultures do experience it. So there is this possibility, and some people indeed argue it very strongly, that we have gone too far with relativism, or at least some of us, and at least sometimes, and that there are absolute goods and bads that need to have to be taken on board, no matter which culture or which society we look at. Now, linked to that, but not the same thing, is to say that, listen, there are things that are going on in the world, and maybe it's the case that we don't need to approve them, and in fact, we can think that they are wrong, even morally wrong, but we can explain them. And so that's a separate thing from, in effect, excusing them or treating them as normal or appropriate given the social context in which they have occurred. And so we can say that it's situational, so that in the Milgram experiment, for example, we can hold to the idea that the people who did the shocking were wrong, and that each of us makes a new pledge that if we're in that circumstance, we will not shock. And we saw there were some holdouts, some people who just didn't do it and wouldn't do it. And so that implies the fact that at least several people wouldn't do it, that a minority, but still, people wouldn't do it, that implies that although we can explain it and that we need the sociological eye in order to make that explanation, that doesn't necessarily mean the same thing as accepting it, excusing it, or in a sense absolving the people who participated, and maybe even giving them some blame, retaining the capacity to blame, and then other people might even say to punish because of the fact that they did not rise above the circumstance in which they were living. There is no excuse for Adolf Eichmann to help organize, play a central role in organizing the destruction of the victims of Hitler, even though it is, as Hannah Arendt pointed out, and as Stanley Milgram in a way points out as well, that it is understandable. So that's a separate thing, and we can have relativism at our side to understand how it is that things occur, yet still cling to the idea that there are absolute rights and wrongs. And these matters that I'm now talking to you about infuse not only the social sciences and thinking in the social sciences, but also the field of philosophy and law. And so in the law schools of the world, really, these issues are debated because out of it comes, of course, the system of law and punishment that you put in place and whether you think it is appropriate or not. For us sociologists, one of the things that becomes very clear is that you certainly can alter the rate at which people do things you don't like by altering the conditions that surround them. And one of the slogans used to be that people aren't evil, it is conditions that are evil. And so the solution becomes to manipulate the situation, to manipulate the set of contingencies through which people operate. And this term you're reading, an article about baboons, I'll say it without the falsetto voice, about baboons. And the reason why we're reading about baboons in sociology is not because baboons are like people but hairy. It's because here we have something like a human culture that has taken, that operates in a world that seems so remote from our own, and indeed it is remote from our own. And I'd emphasize the word seems to, but we'll just grab that seems to, and that's why I thought it would be interesting and useful to look at baboons for just a moment. And when we do look at baboons, and the research that Sapolsky, who's at Stanford, has done, a biologist, what we learn is that the way of life among the baboons can be more or less aggressive, can be more or less hierarchical, can be more or less macho, more or less feminist, more or less abusive, and that he sees it because of an accident that happened in the field in which the most aggressive baboons, who always had first dibbies on all the food, which is what aggressiveness, that and sex is what aggressiveness among baboons is a lot about, that the aggressive baboons got to the tourist site where the garbage was with the food supply, but it was poisoned. And that caused, it had rotted through sort of natural rotting, had become poisonous, and that killed off the most aggressive baboons, who were the first in, and so they were the ones who in fact died. And this then changed the culture. That is that Sapolsky, and as he's trying to, as he bends to make this work more popular and accessible, they actually use the term bad guys. The bad guys died. And it didn't mean that new bad guys arose, not at least in the same way or the same degree. And instead, these became more peaceful societies without the aggressive bad guys. And this is the real payoff, which is that as new young males came into the troop, either by migrating in from other troops, because that is the way those troops change, or by being raised and being adolescent young males who are, of course, the worst creatures in the world. Some of you are still practicing that faith. As that happens, those new recruits adhere to, I'll use the word culture, of the baboon troop as it has come to emerge without the bad guys, with the bad guys dead. And so that means that baboon culture can sustain itself. Now, this is all very big news to people who study animals because it becomes evidence for something like culture among the other creatures of the world. But I want to very much emphasize that this is a far cry from the cultures that we have. And so the way our cultures change is not by the bad guys being killed off. That doesn't make sense, and history doesn't provide evidence of that. The weak people, the victims, are the people who die off, for example, in the Hitler case. It certainly doesn't change the society through that mechanism. We have totally different mechanisms due to the fact that we are interpreters, symbol-making people who then build very complicated institutions and cultures. And the baboons don't do that. But what it does tell us is that there is something about a culture that can be more aggressive and less aggressive, and that it can perpetuate itself over time. And then that helps us to make the next move when we think about human societies, that maybe it's not the individuals and who contain the seeds of the problem, but rather it's the way in which the society is organized that does it. And so we have countries that are organized for war. The German nation right now, as a result of World War II and the role it played, is probably, it is certainly among the most pacific societies in the world, where war, capital punishment is unacceptable to a degree, of course, far more so than it is here in the United States. It is a society that has become much, far less violent, not only than it was, but far less violent than most countries in the world. And so we do know that you can change the circumstances through historical events, but also by, as Milgram showed, manipulating the structure of even that experiment. You can change the outcome. Now, one of the examples that is much been in the news is the problem of child molestation, which I mentioned. And one of the key sites of child molestation in recent years that we have all seen in the news are the molestation by Catholic priests of boys primarily, but both boys and girls. And I've always thought of that as almost a poster child of sociological organization in trying to understand deviance. Because what the church has done institutionally, and there are historic reasons for that, which I won't spend any time with, but what the church has done and created is an institution in which celibacy is the criterion for membership. And so young males in adolescence are recruited into an occupation, into a way of life, which then puts in their path young people, lots of people, but young people in particular who are very naive, very trusting, and themselves highly sexual. And so now we have created a situation, when you think about it, if we would do a checklist of what you would ideally set up in order to create the circumstances of something that we label as child molestation, that's exactly what you would set up. I can't imagine a more perfect storm of arrangements in which a particular behavior would then follow on. And so one way of dealing with it is to see the priests who do this to young boys and girls as perverts, that the devil is in them. And the word pervert is a way of, in fact, calling someone as having the devil in them in some way. And that's what's causing it. And the other way of thinking about it is that it is the arrangement. The way this has been organized is certainly going to increase the rate at which this phenomenon obtains. And it will also create anger and hostility by those who are observing it, since these are the very people who are supposed to be the most trusted, and thus they have abused their authority, abused their power, abused their institution, the church, by their misguided behaviors. But the guided is in the institutional setup. That would be the sociological explanation. And so if you take that mode of thinking and explaining to other things that we label as deviant, that would be the ticket for generating a larger understanding across the board, not just of the church, not just of sexual miscreants, but of many other kinds as well. Well, what this starts signaling then is that there are patterns to this deviance phenomenon, that it isn't just about, in some of the examples I gave in the prior class, of one individual labeling another individual, and we're all this system of pointing fingers at one another and mutually exchanging labels. There is, through just our ordinary behavior, a kind of floating system of stigma. We've all been humiliated across our lives at one point or another, at many points, and many more, I will inform you, are coming your way through the kind of interactions we all routinely have. But there are patterns that, in which these labeling forms, the content of different kinds of labels actually stick. And I gave some examples last time, and I'll just go through them again. There's a kind of division of labor. Some people have called it a moral division of labor, in which in each sort of sector of failing, there is a group that specializes in it. So the church and religious institutions in general specialize in moral failing. They point out that someone has sinned, and sometimes what you need to do about it. It depends on the religion as to specifically the degree to which they provide for some form of compensation and mechanism of making good on your sins, paying for your sins in some way or another. But the religious institutions, they own the sin industry, the moral sphere. Teachers control the smartness industry. Who I'm up here, I'm doing that. We'll do that. Me and the TAs. We'll tell you who's done a good job and a bad job, and who is a brilliant student and who is not so brilliant. And in other universities, they identify, other schools, that some people are just unteachable. That's how dumb they are, or that's how crazy they are, or that's how uncooperative they are. And we have therapists in the psychological world and the psychiatric world who determine the degree to which we are crazy or not, and well-adjusted, poorly adjusted, have one disease or another from the manuals that the psychiatrists put together. And we have the police and the courts that indicate who's criminal and who's not. Now, those are just a few examples, but the point is that the labeling system is a system, and it is institutionally located. And as indicated by all of these different spheres, it is really complicated. Each one develops very worked out notions of exactly when one sin begins, one educational problem ends, one kind of criminal act starts and ends, and who gets the electric chair and who gets 25 years, and who gets to go to the halfway house and who goes into some kind of rehab. All of this is enormously complicated, and whole vast efforts of professional and organizational work go into pinpointing exactly who gets identified as having done what and what that indicates should be done with them and about them. So people who are some people, so the system is hierarchical. Some people are higher up in the labeling apparatus than other people. And Becker, who we referred to once before in the class, calls it, I'll use just the last word, a hierarchy of credibility. That some people are higher up in the labeling process than others and have the capacity to call out someone else as deviant in a way that sticks and has consequences compared to others. It's hierarchical. And one of the bases of hierarchy is not just your personal status, like you're a very rich person or a very poor person, but where you are in the institutional setup. Obviously, if you're a judge, you're high up in the hierarchy of credibility compared to if you're a bailiff working in the same setting, in the same kind of courtroom. So it's not only, though, that you have a capacity to influence who gets identified and what happens to them, but it also then is something that you can use to define what deviance is altogether. So one of my favorite examples these days is the Prime Minister of Italy, Berlusconi, who is indicted for one crime after another. But he is so powerful, both personally and because of the institutions he controls, of which he's the president, isn't he, of the country, not the prime minister. No, he's the prime minister. Which is he? Prime minister. It means, therefore, that he has been able, in part through the kind of controls he has over other institutions, to keep redefining what he did as not criminal. And so in that way, he continues to be president or prime minister of the country because he's in a capacity to define what he does as okay. And people who are higher up often have that capability. So it isn't just that they enter a system in which those who occupy positions of authority and power have the ability to identify others, but they also have the ability to manipulate the very institutions that they're a part of to protect themselves. And that then starts having very widespread consequence, as in the case of Italian domestic politics, and determining who indeed is going to be the prime minister of the country. Now, there are some ways we can look at how this sorting apparatus operates to find other aspects of the system and to see it indeed in a more systematic way. So, one of the things that we start noticing as we look at who gets punished and for what, and now let's just talk about the criminal justice system as a mechanism of sorting, we see that those people, and I don't think this will come as a great shock to you, that there are patterns of race, class, and to some degree gender about it all. And that, again, it won't come as a shock to you, that those people who are poor, those people who are people of color, particularly African American and Latino in the American context, are going to do less well in all of this than those who are the other things. And so indeed, the people who get the electric chair in the United States or are put to death by the state in one way or another tend indeed to be poor. They also tend indeed to be minorities, people of color. And the kinds of crimes that poorer people do tend to get the harsher punishments. So even within, well, let's talk about drugs, but drugs in the large sense of those kinds of things that change your consciousness. Alcohol is the most common drug in use in the United States. It's legal, it's commercial, and we know it is a vastly evident presence in all our lives. And it leads to lots of mayhem, particularly in the United States, because people believe that once they drink, they're out of control. And that then leads them to, in fact, be out of control in ways they might otherwise not be. When you get down to the kinds of drugs that poor people use, and particular people of color, you come to something like crack cocaine. Cocaine is a kind of poster boy of punishment studies because crack cocaine and powder cocaine have very similar impacts on the body. They are both artificial substances and they're illegal. But the ratio of punishment, that is, number of days you will spend in prison, is such that you will go to prison for a much longer period of time if you use crack cocaine compared to if you use powder cocaine. And the ratio has been as high as 100 to 1. And when I say as high as it, I don't mean like for just a brief moment in history, it was 101, or just in Alabama, it was 101. That's the typical pattern. You get 100 days in prison for crack cocaine. For every 1 day in prison, you get for powder cocaine. So that is a very, very strong pattern. And that varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, and that's why I said as high as. But it signals a phenomenon in a very dramatic way, because crack cocaine tends to be used by poorer people than powder cocaine, and it is used in particular by African American men and women too, and Latino people. So this then generates a whole series of phenomenon. It generates arrests, it generates police stops of people to see if they've got any of this stuff. It generates putting them in prison. It generates filling our prisons with people. It makes large numbers of residents who would be residents of their neighborhoods, takes them out. And this is, of course, biased toward young men who are found guilty of using or trafficking in crack, and has a major consequence all through the society. There are other examples we can just sort of go through. Loitering is a crime, and it is one that is extremely subjective to determine whether someone's loitering. If you go past, walk past any of the NYU buildings at any given day, you will see lots of NYU students hanging out, is what we call it. Loitering is what we could call it. And if you switch the lens from hanging out to loitering, then you have yourself a possible confrontation with the law, with all of the potential for resentment and mayhem that might obtain when there's a confrontation and someone then gets arrested and sent their merry way into what we call our criminal justice system. Now, as opposed to rich people's crimes, you have to be rich to perform industrial pollution, to ignore and do illegal things vis-a-vis occupational safety, to rig the markets in finance, in banking, or in some other mode of some other kind of product. And you have to be powerful, indeed, to tell lies, including engage in illegal activities that lead to war. Like, for example, the Gulf of Tonkin resolution and the report on the Gulf of Tonkin, which is the event that Lyndon Johnson used to justify the escalation of the Vietnam War, ending up killing hundreds and hundreds of millions of people. And some people said at the time that LBJ should be charged with war crimes under the Geneva Convention. And similarly, some people said that President Bush should be held guilty of war crimes because of the fiction of the weapons of mass destruction that was used to justify the war in Iraq. So These people are, now let's give some data that, but the wars are obvious that many hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people die. In the case of asbestos, which is a poison to the human system, there were, during the period of asbestos punishment, asbestos is now more controlled, but there were approximately 200,000 people died because of asbestos poisoning, because of asbestos in the environment. And the major producer of asbestos, the Johns Manville Corporation, knew it. That is, we now know that they knew inside the corporation that they were producing a poison, a fatal poison, and yet they continued to do it. Now that is against the law. It's also against moral law, we might say. But the kind of punishment that you get for that is relatively weak. Well, in the case of Johns Manville, I mean, there was no criminal punishments, I don't think. 1 in 5 cancers in the United States are job-related. That is, it comes from being exposed, and often the rules of occupational safety betrayed by the employer. Ralph Nader made his reputation, I think in significant degree, through his book Unsafe at Any Speed. And what Nader's point was that the car is being designed in such a way to kill. And I put it in a strong Nader-like way. But I think it's an interesting case, the design of the car, because here you have the mayhem built in to the hardware itself. So if you create a car, for example, where the knobs on the dashboard are shaped literally like bullets, which they did do because they thought that was fun, like rockets, then it means, of course, that on impact, you're going to get a bullet through your head. Now, it's a whole different story, isn't it, than if someone holds up a gun and pulls the trigger and puts a bullet in your head. Or is it not such a whole different story? If you know, especially through the internal experiments in your company and also data that's being brought to you, that your car has this habit of piercing the heads of people, one of the things you can say as a corporate executive at General Motors is they drove unsafe. They were driving in an unsafe way. If they'd obeyed the speed limits, then they wouldn't have had a problem. If they had not taken the risk of driving on a car on the street when a drunk driver was coming through the intersection, then they would be okay today. So it's their fault. I've given you a series of, I don't know if they're plausible, but excuses, let's call it, that could explain why these deaths occurred, as opposed to the idea that it is a death that the executives of General Motors committed. It is their crime, moral and legal, and they should pay the price. And Ralph Nader only wanted for the cars to be redesigned, which they were, by the way, and the dashboard design is only one aspect. Seat belts, steering wheel that collapses, safety glass in the front of the car, all sorts of other things that were done because of the commotion that Ralph Nader created and that Congress only reluctantly approved of because of the social pressures that were generated by this social movement. So Nader wanted the cars made safer, the cars were made safer, and as a result, it turns out that the death rate from auto traffic and auto use went way down, a tremendous decline in traffic death. So it wasn't just somebody making trouble. There was actually a cause and effect between the design of the car and the results. Cars aren't designed out of nothing. Cars are designed within institutions which themselves are run by human beings. And so the question is this a kind of deviance and a moral failing, or indeed something against the law that needs to be dealt with? Well, what we learn is that this is a category of, I'll call it a crime now, that is not punished very severely, or indeed it may not be punished. It may not be punished at all. And what's helpful at a moment like this is to take a look at this little thing that I like to play with. And I'm going to put this, I'll put this on Blackboard so that you will have reference to it and you won't have to scurry to take notes on it right now. But what it does is it's a way of summarizing, at least as a kind of hypothesis form. But there's a great deal, I think, of empirical literature to support that this is an accurate way of looking at the punishment system in the United States. How harsh is the punishment? Is it severe? Is it moderate? Or is it mild? And the answer is it depends on the social class of the perpetrator and the social class of the victim. So, for example, if the status of the victim is high, which is that first square, say status of victim, and then right under it, do I have? Yes, I do. See, here we go. If the victim is a high status person, and the perpetrator is a high status person, that's a kind of middling kind of thing in terms of how severe the punishment will actually be. But if the person who is the victim is high status, and a kidnap victim is an example of that, and the person who does it is low status, then you're going to get very severe punishment. And it's going to play out that way both in the nature of the crime, and kidnapping, of course, corresponds to that kind of crime, very high status. It makes no sense to kidnap a person of low status, and the person who does it is almost by definition going to be someone of much lower status than the victim. And in that case, you will throw the book at them, and the punishment will be very severe. If it is the kind of thing that a high status person, whoops, I didn't know it would do that. I'm just going to leave you with that. You can see how the system works before I screw this thing up and eliminate it from your vision. The idea is that if the victim is going to be a high status person, the punishment is going to be severe. If the victim is going to be a high status person, then a low status person, then the punishment is going to be less severe. And that will run through the whole criminal justice system as a hypothesis. And of course, it is always, all other things being equal, if you kill someone, you'll probably get in trouble. But as we know from the O.J. Simpson case, you may walk away from it, even though there is vast stuff going on your side. So even though murder is punishable severely, if it's a high status person within the murdering dynamic, then there are chances of that will have a moderating effect. In the O.J. Simpson case, a moderating effect indeed, and he gets to walk away. So, so there is another way of putting it informally, a kind of biasing in the system, in the way things work. Well, so what is this all going toward? It's going again toward a notion that labeling, and we'll get back to that as the idea behind all of this, is organized and institutionalized, and that when we look at the kinds of labels that are imposed and the consequences of those labels, we find that it is undemocratic, it's hierarchical, and this is what I want to really point out, is that it has a life of its own. The kinds of biases or patterns of vulnerability become institutionalized and naturalized. And so we don't have to constantly figure out how are we going to put young black men in jail but at the same time spare young white men who are doing the same thing. We don't have to think through that, in part by having a very high penalty for crack cocaine and a weak penalty for powder cocaine. Then that is sort of done automatically. It doesn't require individual prejudice. The whole system is institutionalized, and we're going to talk about race later in the semester, and this is an important idea about race, is that the pattern, and also class, is that it has a life of its own. It becomes a little machine that goes on giving with consistent results, and it doesn't have to be tended in the same way. No one has to get up in the morning and say, I'm a racist. What can I do to oppress black people today? It doesn't need that. And in fact, anybody who does think like that is regarded, I think, by virtually everyone as just a jerk. And we don't need the work of jerks to impose these differential consequences on people based on how much income they have or what the color of their skin is. It becomes automatic. It operates in a kind of automatic way. And so we can start thinking about the people who end up, say, identified as a crackhead, who end up in prison as getting what they deserve, and in fact, as seeing them as essentially deviant. Look at you. You're not in prison, are you? And the great majority of you, and I'm knocking on wood and crossing my fingers, will never be in prison. And that is extremely likely that you will never experience any of those things. But it's because you are the saints and the other people are the roughnecks. And you saints, we saints, I of course am the most saintly of all in the room. Well, no, I mean that. When a cop sees me, it's like exactly why they're on the street. It's exactly why they beat up other people, so that I can go from point A to point B. An NYU professor of a certain age. This is it. This is what it's all about. So that's why I say I am more saintly than you, and I have a whole history of many, many years of saintly acts that I have performed that you have yet to perform. But I think the great majority of you will do quite a few of them, and some of you will indeed surpass me by the time it's all over. So we are given then the capacity to see these other kinds of people as deserving what they get, as different from you and me, that maybe even they think differently, like those kinds of natives indeed think. Otherwise, they wouldn't be in this desperate, odd situation that we now see them in, as opposed to seeing a sequence of organizational and institutional setups that have shunted them, classified them, categorized them, such that they have ended up where they are. Now, what I've just given you is a very common way in which sociologists interpret society and think about deviance and these kinds of activities. However, there is a contrary view, even among people who think sociologically. However, it's a minority view among sociologists, but it is a very strong view among some conservative intellectuals, including leading African American intellectuals. And it goes something like this, is that sociology has gone too far, not just in the kind of explanations that I've just given you of what deviance is and where it comes from, but also we have gone too far in terms of getting our ideas loose into the society. And in particular, we have done too good a job, in a way, of getting those ideas into the minds of the very people who perform these illegitimate actions. And it causes them to, and their allies, to make excuses for what goes on in their world, for what they do and don't do. And the target of all of this discussion is primarily young black men. That young black men are not just people who have been shunted from one place to another due to these kinds of laws that I've been talking about. And I haven't even talked about the mode of policing, the way of working the streets that identifies these men for doing things that if they were being done by, say, white young men, the saints, it would indeed come out differently. That by talking this talk that I've been doing this session and last session, by talking this talk, this stuff has got into the minds of those very people as well as of their allies. And they are given too many excuses. In West Side Story, Officer Krumke, do you know that song? Everybody knows West Side Story, right? No, raise your hand if you know West Side Story. All right, everybody has. Officer, and great musical. Officer Krumke, what's the rest of it? The social disease. Does anybody know that line? Come on, you know it. What is it? Yeah. You don't know it? Okay, I thought we had a volunteer. Anyway, in the delinquent boys are engaged in a song with the cop on the beat, Officer Krumke, and my mother was a junkie, or my mother is a junkie, my father wears a dress, holy golly, that's why I'm a mess. And then the chorus is, Officer Krumke, we're down on our knees. Da 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 da. We have a social disease. So what I've in a way described, or the way Leonard Bernstein would describe it, is that these people have a social disease. And if you have a disease, you're not responsible, and so forth, and so on. And the argument is, not necessarily the way conservatives put it, but the way I'll put it in sort of bending in the wind of the conservative sociological orientation, is to say, well, yes, the system is biased, and yes, it's rigged. It creates challenges for, let's say, young African-American men that it doesn't create nearly to the same degree for other people. And once you're identified through the color of your skin or the poverty of your family or the things you did at another point in time, once you're identified as a roughneck, switching to the sainthood is going to be a real job. But it can happen, and that's the point, is that there is room to survive and indeed to move beyond survival. And now we have a history in which we have very large numbers of people who grew up poor, who grew up African American, who grew up male, who grew up the combination of all three, and who not only survived, but in fact do well. So again, remember the Milgram experiment, that even in that setting, where everything is rigged to get those people to perform in a certain way and to pull that switch for punishment, a certain number of them don't. And now we see that in the world of moving up the ladder, of status attainment, of staying out of jail, of becoming the Attorney General of the United States, in fact, there is lots of room for maneuver. Enough room for maneuver. Those people who think we need a completely democratic country or a more democratic country say no, it's rigged and it's terrible and we've got to direct all our attention to that. But then some people say these conservative intellectuals, led by African American male intellectuals, by the way, are saying, wait a minute, by spreading this gospel so deeply into society, it reaches, and sociology will do that. That is, the things we talk about in this class, it's not like you understand patterns which, like in the chem lab, where the matter you're dealing with doesn't change because of the fact that we're coming to understand it. That's not exactly precisely true, but to a degree in the social sciences, once the social science points it out, then it changes the very phenomenon that we are describing. So, for example, when Lord Humphrey said that these men who go to the men's room and perform sex there are typical ordinary men, then that changed society's attitude toward homosexuality. It helped to change it at least, which then indeed alters what gay men do, because now they're gay, they're not homosexual, and they can go to bars or whatever that are set up for their social lives, or not even do it at all, just meet here in class, and then that's the end of the whole story. We don't have to do the men's room. So the point is that by explaining the world, sociologists change that world. And in this case, the fact that the sociologists, quote, make excuses by showing the contingencies that lead people into poverty and sustain them in their poverty, or lead them to commit crimes and causes them to continue into a pattern, that way of explaining things has a consequence on the very people we're talking about. And the conservative intellectuals are saying that is a bad consequence, and that we need to get these people to take responsibility for their own behavior, pull themselves up by their bootstraps, take advantage of the opportunities that are there. Otherwise, the sociologists will perpetuate the very inequalities that they are trying to ameliorate. I want to just spend a minute or two on one more final point, and that is that I've been talking about society and its little deviances, as though what I was describing in this course so far is a world in which the world goes on, and then you have sort of on the boundaries, on the edges, people who are doing things that are odd or wrong, and what are we going to do about that? The alternative is to think of deviance, and it's the system of deviance, and that's what those inverted commas always mean, the system of deviance, as not a kind of sideshow to the organization of society, but indeed to say that deviance is woven into society. That is, that this whole thing, when you look at it, not just in the criminal system, but in the educational system, we talked about why you're here and the chosen and who got into the Ivy League and who didn't. All of that is actually building the society, so that deviance is woven into society, and every aspect of where we are and what we are is a kind of result of these kinds of sorting arrangements in which some people are regarded, at the extreme at least, as having spoiled identities. That's a term that's sometimes used. Spoiled identities. They're human pollutants, to use extreme language, or in most more moderate terms, just not as good, not as high, not as worthy as other people. And this is a vast system. And it reaches into, for example, politics. So, which some people, including political scientists, would say is the most important aspect of society. It's what organizes us all. I gave the example of Berlusconi, but politicians typically have an attitude of and promote the idea and get elected when they say they're going to get them, when they're going to catch those people who are the moral threats to our society. And that includes terrorists and potential terrorists, and people who are kind of like terrorists, and you never know, they may be what will grow up to be terrorists. We have to get them. We have to get them at the border. We have to keep them from sneaking over from Mexico. We need to get them here. We need to get them there. That this is an important part of our political life. We have to. The mayor of Philadelphia some years ago, Mayor Rizzo, was asked if he believed in the electric chair. And he said he believed in the electric sofa. And that generated a whole lot of increased popularity for Mayor Rizzo among some people in the culture, the electric sofa. And a lot of folks do the same thing. Well, so it affects politics within the United States. It also affects politics around the world. So in Colombia, in Mexico, the drug cartels are the basis in many places of what government there is. And it is an engine of corruption. The economy of the Taliban is now based in drugs, in poppies and the heroin industry. The Italian mafia in Italy is heavily interlinked, as is Berlusconi. Our allies in Panama at a past time were incriminated in the drug industry. The CIA has been involved in the drug industry internationally at one form or another. And the engine of all of that is that little set of laws that were enacted in the United States in the early 20th century that said that certain substances would be illegal, that the wisdom of the founding fathers who got high whenever they wanted to was not going to be the wisdom that we would in fact use. And instead, certain things would be against the law, and we would hunt them down and smoke them out when we found out who those people were. One of the consequences of that is to raise the price of drugs. And when the price of drugs goes up, it means that the risks that can be taken to create the drugs, to ship it to market, so that it can find its consumers is worth paying. So the labeling in this country, the enforcement of those labels in the criminal system, in the criminal justice system, all of this acts to make the product more valuable when it finally reaches the market, which generates it a higher capacity or a greater effort to produce it, despite the many risks and liabilities in doing it, which then incorporates the politics of other countries, the payoff of politicians in other parts of the world, the changes in regimes, and the determining of the nature of those regimes in other parts of the world, as well as the whole cowboy apparatus that then gets set up to enforce the laws against these cartels and the corruption and violence that comes in that path. The United States has been closely linked into both sides. We are, if there's one side, I think we are, this is my guess, predominantly on the side of, is that we are against drugs, and our policies in other countries are anti-drug. But at various times and for various strategic reasons, we don't do that. We are ourselves in bed with the drug producers, either because they were fighting communism under the prior era or because they are fighting against terrorism in the current era. And so one way or another, the United States becomes involved in acquiescing to the production of drugs and cooperating with the people who are most benefiting or who are allied with those who are most benefiting from that drug trade. So now we've gone the full circle. That's what I wanted to do today. I wanted to go full circle. I wanted to make the link between the kinds of decisions we make in our ordinary life about who's a good person, who's a bad person, what a good person does and what a bad person does, including things like use of alcohol versus use of a different kind of opiate, and how that then gets institutionalized in American law and in American politics, and that its reach goes all through American society as it influences which people are in our prisons and how large our prison system is, which of course is now the largest in the world, and then also influences international phenomenon, the status of regimes around the world, and the kind of role that the U.S. plays both by providing and safeguarding the market for drugs through its illegalization of drug use in the United States, as well as the kinds of then relations that we establish with drug-producing peoples in the world. So that's the whole soup to nuts thing. I hope you all have your coffee after this and rouse up all yourself with a perfectly legal drug. See ya.